Okay.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for the opportunity. I have to say this is my first trip to Kosovo. It's also the first trip of my colleague, Gene Kramer. Gene Kramer also works at the Marshall Center where I work. The Marshall Center is a partnership between the U.S. Department of Defense and the German Ministry of Defense. Mrs. Kramer is responsible for our language program, and she has quite a large number of specialists in languages. I don't think Albanian is one of the languages in which we work.
It will be.
But yes.
It will be, yeah.
Excellent. I've never been to Kosovo before, and when I realized that I had the opportunity to come here, I spoke with one of our Kosovars. We have frequently Kosovars who come to the Marshall Center for our short courses at the Marshall Center. Usually they're government officials, usually they're mid-career government officials, and I asked this particular Kosovar what to expect, and he said, well, it's a country of very intelligent and courageous people, hardworking, but fun-loving, and very attractive. And what I've seen so far in just 2 days confirms that. It's a country of real attractive qualities. There's no question about it. A country with, I think, some what we would call great opportunities in the future. There is a reason that we came here, and the reason that we came here is because we wanted to learn more about Kosovo, because we have not been here in the past, because it's not in my responsibility area. We have defined the responsibilities in our team of about 25 professors, and my responsibilities are all associated with Russia and the countries immediately adjacent, basically, to Russia, countries of Central Asia. So I don't work. One of my colleagues does work with his colleagues in this region, but I don't. So I've never been here before. The reason that this has become particularly important to me is because of the representation of the consequences, the political consequences of Kosovo's independence for other states, particularly the states that surround Russia. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the case of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, also the case of Transnistria, portion of Moldova. Also the so-called unresolved conflicts or frozen conflicts such as Nagorno-Karabakh. These are issues which increasingly our colleagues from Moscow and the regions that are influenced by Moscow approach, so to speak, increasingly these are areas in which there's significant difference of understanding. And so I wanted to come here to see for myself, to meet with some of the Kosovars, to see if it would be possible at some point for some of my colleagues from Kosovo to join us with some of our activities involved with Kazakhs from Kazakhstan and Uzbeks who face similar kinds of questions but don't have real insight into the Kosovar situation. So I took this opportunity to come here and had the good opportunity to meet Professor Hoti, and he asked me if I would be willing to meet with you, and of course it's a great opportunity. He asked me what I would like to talk about, and I said, well, how about something simple like war and peace? He said, okay. War and peace. It certainly is something that is important for us. My field is basically international relations and a subfield of international relations, which we refer to as comparative foreign policy. Foreign policies are the ways that states conduct their affairs with their neighbors and with other countries around the world. Foreign policies basically are a kind of expression of administrative capability and legal insight. So there is an aspect of law and an aspect of public administration that's really important to the conduct of foreign policies. And when we think about international relations, we tend to think in terms of the basic model of state-to-state relationships that hasn't always been the case, that emerged basically as a result of a very long war in Europe. And the principles of societies recognizing themselves only through the recognition of other societies as having equal legitimacy and to be juridically equal with them, the so-called Grotian systems that emerged after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, are what has been adopted as the basic structure of international affairs. It hasn't always been successful in Europe or in other places. One thinks of the Grotian system, the idea that states are entitled to legitimacy. They respect the legitimacy and territorial integrity of other states. They protect their own interests. They pursue those through foreign policies. Those are an expression of the administration of the state and the state's interpretation of legal principles. Those arrangements have not been entirely successful. One thinks of Europe, for instance, as a period of accumulating disequilibrium and then a war. One thinks, for instance, of the Napoleonic Wars and the resolution of that period in 1812. One thinks of the wars of the middle part of the 19th century and the resolution with a restoration, basically, of monarchical authority. One thinks of the First World War and then of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, basically, that kind of system, the principles that emerged from Grotius and the Westphalian system, were reinstated. And you'll recall that the charter document that guided the solution, basically, to the Second World War, the UN Charter, was drafted and signed in 1944 in San Francisco. And it was signed by 53 signatories, 53 states. If you look at the signatories in the documents today, you find 193, unless a new state has come in when I wasn't looking. But 193. So in that period, between 1945, the end of the war, and the present period, the world has changed remarkably. When you think of how that affects people, I think it's important to bear in mind that we are, as human beings, we are organisms, we are biological organisms, and we are party to all the other kinds of things that biological organisms do. What are the basic things that drive organisms? One is certainly all organisms, everything living, including humans, are predators. We actually consume other things, and we take the energy from those other things. We also compete. Anyone who studied biology has studied competition. Also, another third aspect of what biological organisms do is mutualism. We cooperate. From the point of view of international law, from the point of view of comparative foreign policy, and finding ways to calibrate how to most effectively cooperate, what we have to do is think in terms of the field that we exist in. How do we compete effectively and cooperate? When you think back deep into history, you'll notice that people always did rely on mutualism. They always did cooperate. But there's lots of evidence of conflict. And when conflict comes to the extreme, it comes to war. When people fought, what they fought on was the ground. They fought on the soil, basically. It took them a long time to devise an instrument that made it possible for them to fight on water. I don't know if anybody here has a sailboat. Has anybody sailed on a sailboat? Which direction does a sailboat go? Let me just ask that question.
Wind direction?
Pardon me?
Wind direction?
Which?
I'm not sure.
That's a very good answer. Which direction does a sailboat go? It goes in the wind direction. But the wind is only blowing at a given moment in one direction. And if you don't want to go in that direction, how do you use it? You go in the wind direction and you change the direction of the wind. About 3,000 years ago, people invented something called a lateen sail, which would basically allow the sail to change the wind direction, in a sense. So you can go in 360 degrees. That wasn't always possible. As soon as people found that they could do that, they vastly expanded trade and commerce. They also expanded war. People first fought war only on ground. When they found how to be able to fight war on water, they started doing it. It was only a little over 100 years ago when we discovered how to fight in the air. So war has always been fought on the ground, on the water, or in the air. And just in the most recent time, we found a way to do something else. And I want to, you may not agree with me on this topic, but I think it's a profound difference from the world that we lived in not so long ago. When you think of land and air and water, you're thinking of basically a Cartesian field that can be explained in terms of 3 dimensions, an X, Y, and Z dimension, the dimension in which we all live. There is a new dimension, and that dimension was just discovered a few decades ago, not long ago. It was originally discovered actually in the Soviet Union by Vladimir Kotelnikov. He found a way of translating analog physical signals into a digital representation, allowing to modulate and demodulate, to take a physical signal, such as a sound, and turn it into a digital representation. The digital representation is a concatenation, a very long concatenation of plus and minus, or 1, 0, however you want to characterize it. But it does not itself take up space. It is not in space. So when we talk about the 3 dimensions of war in the past, and we add this new dimension, this cyber dimension, we're not talking about another 4th axis. We're talking about something that's substantially different. But cooperation in the future, and as a consequence, conflict in the future, will also be, already is, in this 4th dimension. This is changing the way that we think about how to cooperate, and we think about how to win in conflict. When you think about the responsibilities of a diplomat representing the state, pursuing the interests of the state, frequently you think about the choices before the diplomat. The diplomat, in any kind of negotiation, has an objective that she or he wants to achieve. If I go into a restaurant, and I went into a number of restaurants here and had delicious meals, and what we would do is pick up the menu, and we would select what we wanted on the menu. That's called choice. It's basically an economic choice. That's different than a concept called strategic choice. Strategic choice is when you know what your preferences indicate to you. But what you actually articulate as your choice is going to depend upon what the person on the other side of the table is going to choose. So you calculate not only your own preferences and the resources that you have available in order to achieve those, but what you expect the other side is thinking about. Historically, the real problems of diplomats was to get insight into what the other side was calculating, what the other side intended to do. Increasingly in this cyber world, where information is more available, it becomes more difficult to understand the objectives of the other side. At the Marshall Center, what we do is we bring about 1,000 mid-career, mid-level specialists, about half of whom are in uniform, and the other half come from ministries of foreign affairs, or sometimes from the police, sometimes, in rare cases, from medicine, sometimes from intelligence, sometimes from justice. We bring them together to discuss problems, how they see the problems, and how they see solutions. We are not an educational institution in the sense that educational institutions transfer knowledge and then they evaluate whether a student has assimilated, absorbed the knowledge, and then they certify that the student has that knowledge and goes out into the world. That's a traditional educational institution. The Marshall Center is not like that. Our job is somewhat different. I work with, under the direction of a general, a U.S. Army general, and he's very plainly pointed out to me, when I started as a junior officer, as lieutenant in the Army, I had one job, and that was very simple. Kill the enemy, destroy the enemy's assets. That was all I had to do. That was all we were taught. That was all that was required. Now, in just the span of one generation, the requirements of a military officer are dramatically different. You have to understand the other side. In some cases, you will have to cooperate with the other side. In some cases, you will have to coerce the other side, or manipulate, or cajole, or somehow change the behavior of the other side. These are not things that the military did in the past. One of the big problems that diplomats face now is whether the role of a diplomat is different in this world that's so rich in information. In the past, publics did not play an important role in diplomatic negotiations. Increasingly, however, the public is aware that the negotiations are taking place. And increasingly, the public has an influence on the negotiations. If you think historically about security, the greatest security that France had, the greatest security that Germany had, was basically the territory between the Germans and the French. That's what made it possible to defend, because it took, whether it was invading French or invading Germans, it took quite a long time. That time is gone. This fourth dimension, this cyber dimension, has dramatically changed the way in which states interact. The real purpose of the Marshall Center is to find ways of thinking about these changes that are taking place, to find ways of developing the curriculum for our own military and our own security specialists that would equip them for periods of conflict and cooperation when there isn't the time to retrain or rethink about things. It's quite a challenge, and it's a privilege to have Kosovars who come to the Marshall Center because they give us great insight. What I think would be really valuable is if we had the opportunity at some point to organize a conference that would make it possible for some of the analysts, the scholars here, to travel to, for instance, the Marshall Center to discuss, along with our colleagues from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and other countries that face similar problems, different in terms of their implications, but want to find more about the insight of your own experience. So I've just said a few things about war and peace and about the history of the world, I think, and about technology. And I'd be happy to respond to any questions, and perhaps Ms. Kramer would also be interested.